Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 50 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last series we spent time in the revised and expanded letters volume, looking primarily at letters around and shortly after the time of the publication of The Lord of the Rings. And we're certainly going to get back to the letters again. There is so much in them, especially now that we have the revised edition. But this series, I want to go back to Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book, The Inklings. Now, we spent March and April in this book a couple of series back as we got to know C.S. Lewis a bit better. And in week 41 at the very end of the series, we first learned a little bit about Charles Williams. And since we only scratched the surface with Tolkien and Williams in that final week's Tolkien Tuesday, let's go back to learn a little bit more about their friendship. Now, last time I read from letter 276, which was written in 1965. At that point, Tolkien claimed to have known Williams only as a friend of C.S. Lewis, and he says that they had nothing to say to one another at deeper or higher levels. There he also said that he was and remains wholly unsympathetic to Williams' mind. But that letter was written in 1965, 20 years after Charles Williams died. Let's go back to the years where they spent time together in the Inklings to see what their relationship was like at the time. Now, we do know that Williams moved to Oxford in September of 1939, and that he was a regular member of the Inklings within a couple of months. But we first see a mention of his name in Tolkien's letters in July of 1943, in letter 49a to Christopher, where Tolkien writes that he'd gone to Magdalen and finished the reading of my essay and handed over 3/4 to Charles Williams. Now, later that year in November, he writes letter 51b to Christopher and notes that he has heard 2 chapters of new novel by Charles Williams read by him this morning. Yesterday, I had half an hour with him at the White Horse. So, it's not just the bird and baby that these two frequent. Oh, and that new novel that Tolkien mentioned in the letter to Christopher was All Hallows' Eve, which would be published in 1945. Now, by December 9th, Tolkien's life is so busy that in letter 53 he laments not having seen CSL for weeks or Williams. A week later, on the 15th of December, he writes to Christopher saying, "Last night after 8 p.m., I sallied forth into the bitterest night we have had for 2 years and visited Magdalen College. I hadn't seen C.S. Lewis or Charles Williams for a month. I found the 2 Lewises and Charles and Hugo sitting over port and dessert and already very noisy. At any rate, CSL no less than Hugo. He had a cold coming on and had already partly drowned it. The effect is, as usual, to make him recite very loudly." A short but pleasant break in the common task. It broke up at 11 p.m. and was resumed in the Mitre at 11:30 a.m. this morning. So they seem to have not only spent a great deal of time together, but to have enjoyed that time immensely, and even to have been on the same page, so to speak. In November 1944, Tolkien writes to Christopher and says, "I saw C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams from about 1040 to 1250, but can recollect little of the feast of reason and flow of soul, partly because we all agree so." Now, that doesn't sound like somebody Tolkien knew only as a friend of Lewis. And as for not having anything to say at deeper or higher levels to one another, Carpenter points out at least one such occurrence. He writes, "It was a Thursday night when Tolkien was walking home after a Magdalen session of the Inklings. As he lived in North Oxford, his journey took him past Williams's front door in South Parks Road. I did not start home till midnight," Tolkien recorded, "and walked with C.W. part of the way, when our converse turned on the difficulty of discovering what common factors, if any, existed in the notions associated with freedom as used at present. I don't believe there are any, for the word has been so abused by propaganda that it has ceased to have any value for reason and become a mere emotional dose for generating heat." And think about that, right? It's 1944, it's the war, so freedom is a concept that would have been talked a lot about, but in a way its meaning diluted. Now, even though they had talks and enjoyed their time together, they would find that they had different tastes, at least in literature. In December 1944, he wrote to Christopher saying that he'd spent 2 hours with CSL and CW. It was very enjoyable. We talked a good deal about prosody, and, more than I cared for, about C. Lamb, an author that I find no use for, I fear. Now, Carpenter writes that during this time, the conversations between the 3 men became, as a result, more generally literary than Tolkien always cared for. He himself was not widely read in English literature after Chaucer, and he had few favorites among later writers. On the other hand, Williams and Lewis liked almost everything. Now that takes me back to our week 34 Tolkien Tuesday when we talked about the Lit Lang debate. One faction believed that it ought to be based on ancient and medieval texts in their language, with at most only a brief excursion into modern literature. By modern, they meant anything later than Chaucer. These people wanted an English course that was as severe a discipline as a study of the classics. On the other side were those who thought the most important thing was to study the whole range of English literature up to the present day. That's all from Carpenter earlier in the Inklings. Now, of course, it appears that Lewis and Williams were on the wrong side of that debate as Tolkien was concerned, though the three certainly remained good friends at the time. For now, folks, that wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as we learn more about Tolkien and Williams and look at a poem that Tolkien wrote about his unusual friend. And be sure to join me next Friday as I interview Serena Higgins, specifically about the Tolkien-Williams friendship. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join my content council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You also can support the show and get an ad-free feed, a bonus episode every week, and more. Please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.